The sound of the river was the first thing I ever remember, and years later, the last thing I heard before my world ended. I grew up by that river. It wasn't just water to me, it was family. It sang me lullabies when I was a girl. It carried our laughter when my children played by its edge, and it whispered stories to me at night when my husband held me close. We built our little home on the high bank, a modest wooden house surrounded by wildflowers and tall reeds that danced when the wind came down the valley. Life was simple then. My husband, Daniel, worked as a carpenter in town. Our two children, Emma and Paul, were the kind of kids that filled silence with joy, always running barefoot, always smelling of sunshine and river water. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered. I used to wake before dawn, make coffee in an old kettle, and sit on the porch to watch the mist rise off the river. Daniel would join me quietly, his arm around my shoulder, saying nothing at all because we didn't need words. Happiness is often silent, but silence can also carry warnings. That year, the rains came early, heavier, longer, and meaner than anyone remembered. The river swelled day after day, and I watched it like a mother watching a sick child, helpless, anxious, praying for mercy. Daniel said not to worry. He said the house had stood for 20 years and would stand for 20 more. But the ground was changing beneath us. One night, the rain sounded different, not like water falling, but like something roaring. I stepped outside and froze. The river had risen to the garden fence. I shouted for Daniel, and within minutes he was awake, pulling boots on, calling the children. We tried to move things upstairs, boxes, photos, memories. The water crept in anyway, cold and fast, soaking everything we owned. Daniel told me to take the kids to the hill behind the house. I hesitated. I didn't want to leave him, but he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Nora, go. I'll be right behind you." I carried Emma on my hip, held Paul's hand, and we ran into the storm. The rain slapped our faces, the wind screamed in our ears. Halfway up the hill, I looked back. The house was gone. Just gone, like the earth had swallowed it whole. I screamed Daniel's name again and again, but the storm swallowed my voice too. I ran down a few steps before a wave of water surged up and pushed me back. I never saw him again. When morning came, the river was calm again, cruelly calm. I found my son clinging to a tree root, shaking but alive. My daughter's small hand was still in mine, but she wasn't breathing. That day, the river took my husband and my little girl. It left me with a son, a wound that never closed, and a silence that lasted for years. I buried what I could find of them on the hill. Paul and I rebuilt a shack nearby, but I stopped looking at the river. I stopped listening to it. I stopped being myself. Years passed and Paul grew. He left for the city, saying the river made him feel haunted. I understood. When he left, I was truly alone. But something strange happened then. The river changed again. It grew quiet, gentle, almost kind. Sometimes when I sat by the bank, I could swear I heard Daniel's voice in the current, calling softly, "Nora, don't turn your back on life." I hated that river, and yet I couldn't leave it, because deep down I knew the same river that destroyed me might someday be the one to save me. The second spring after the flood arrived quietly, as if afraid to disturb me. The trees along the river bloomed again, stubborn and bright, and I hated them for it. How could the world still find beauty after what it had done? I lived in a small wooden shack on the hill, overlooking what used to be my home. From there, I could see the river every day, twisting and shining like nothing ever happened. It was cruel, that kind of beauty. I spent my mornings with my hands buried in the soil, planting small vegetables, just to keep my mind from thinking. Every night I'd sit on the porch and stare at the water, daring it to take me too. But it didn't. It just kept flowing, whispering softly, as if mocking me. One afternoon, as the sun was falling low, I heard a voice calling out near the riverbank. It startled me. No one came here anymore. When I reached the edge, I saw a young man standing by the water, struggling to pull something from the current. At first I thought it was driftwood, but when I got closer, I realized it was a small goat, tangled in reeds, bleeding helplessly. Without thinking, I waded in. The water was cold and rough against my legs, but the boy and I worked together, pulling the poor creature free. When we dragged it to the bank, both of us were breathless, soaked, and laughing a little in disbelief. "Thank you," he said. "I thought I'd lose it." The boy was maybe 20, with dark hair and tired eyes. He told me his name was Eli, that he just moved to the nearby village, trying to start over after losing his parents in a flood further down the valley. The words hit me like stones. Another flood. I looked at him differently then. His eyes carried the same emptiness I used to see in the mirror. We sat by the river until the sun disappeared. He told me he was rebuilding an old house on the far side of the forest, and that sometimes the silence got too heavy to bear. I understood that silence well, the kind that hums between grief and guilt. The next morning, I saw him again. He waved from across the river as he led his goats to graze. Day after day, I noticed him, cutting wood, repairing fences, planting seeds. There was something about his persistence, his quiet strength, that softened something inside me. One day, he brought me a small basket of apples for helping me and for keeping me company from across the river. I smiled for the first time in years. It felt strange, like using muscles that had forgotten how to move. Eli started visiting more often. He would tell me stories about his parents, about how his mother used to sing to the river to keep it calm during storms. I told him I didn't believe in such things anymore, but he just smiled. You don't have to believe, you just have to listen. That night, I sat by the river alone. For the first time, I didn't hear Daniel's voice. I heard something softer, the sound of life continuing, of the earth healing, of time doing its quiet work. The river didn't feel like my enemy anymore. It felt like a mirror, showing me what I had become. Scarred, yes, but still moving. As weeks passed, Eli's visits became my anchor. He reminded me of Paul, though I never said it aloud. Sometimes we'd sit in silence, watching the water. Sometimes he'd talk about rebuilding the world in small pieces. One fence, one wall, one heart at a time. One evening, after a long rain, the river rose again. I froze when I saw the water creeping closer, memories flashing like lightning. Eli ran up the hill shouting, "It's all right. It'll stop before it reaches us." But my hands were shaking, my breath gone. He took my hand, firm and steady, and said, "You survived it once, Nora. You can face it again." And somehow I did. We stood there together until the rain eased and the water retreated, leaving behind only the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. That night, I didn't dream of drowning. I dreamt of my husband smiling, my daughter laughing, and a river that no longer wanted to take, but to give back. For the first time since that night, I whispered to the river, "Thank you," and I meant it. That summer, the world around me began to change. Or maybe, for the first time in years, I finally started to see it again. The grass along the riverbank grew tall and soft, the trees thickened with shade, and the mornings came with that cool mist I used to love when Daniel was alive. But now, when the sun touched the water, it didn't hurt my heart as it once did. It felt like something sacred had returned. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. Just enough to breathe without breaking. Eli had become part of my days. He would stop by with his goats or bring me a loaf of bread he baked himself. Sometimes we didn't say much. He'd mend the fence while I tended to the small garden I'd started near the porch. He once told me that the earth heals when we touch it with love. I didn't know if I believed him, but every time I felt the soil under my fingers, I could almost feel my heart waking up. One morning, he came running up the hill, calling my name. He'd been digging near the bank to set up a water channel for his crops, and he'd found something. I followed him down, the sunlight sharp on the rippling river, and when he pointed, I saw it. Half buried in mud, an old wooden box. My breath caught. I recognized it instantly. It was Daniel's. We'd kept our most precious things in that box. Small letters, Emma's first drawing, a photograph from our wedding day. I knelt in the mud, my fingers trembling as I brushed the dirt away. The box was soaked and cracked, but somehow it had survived all those years beneath the current. I carried it back up to the porch, my heart pounding. The wood gave way easily under my hands. Inside were scraps of paper, ruined and faded, except one, a small note, folded tight, wrapped in a bit of cloth. The writing was blurred, but I knew that handwriting anywhere. If you find this, Nora, I want you to live. That was all. I stared at it for a long time. The tears didn't come like they used to, heavy and sharp. They came quiet, soft, like the rain that nourishes instead of destroys. Eli didn't say anything. He just sat beside me, his hands resting loosely on his knees, looking out at the river as if he too had heard Daniel's voice in the wind. That night, I took a lantern and walked to the water. The stars were bright and the river was calm. No longer a monster, no longer my enemy. I placed Daniel's note in a small jar and set it gently on the surface, letting the current carry it away. I forgive you, I whispered, and I forgive the river too. The wind shifted, soft and warm, brushing through the reeds. For a moment, I could almost feel them near me, Daniel and Emma, laughing like the sound of the current over stones. From that day on, I started rebuilding my old garden by the river. I cleared the ground where our house once stood and planted flowers, wild daisies, lilies, and a small patch of wheat, just as Daniel used to. I told myself it wasn't about replacing what I'd lost. It was about keeping their memory alive in the only way that made sense, through life, through growth. Eli helped me build a small wooden bench facing the river, for when you need to talk to them, he said. It became my place of prayer. Every evening, I'd sit there, whispering stories of my day, who I met, what I planted, how the weather was kind. I wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, Paul returned. I hadn't seen my son in nearly a decade. He'd heard from someone in the nearby town that his mother still lived by the same cursed river. When I saw him walking up the hill, tall and worn from the years, I couldn't speak. We just held each other for what felt like forever. He looked around, surprised to see the garden, the repaired fence, the house with fresh paint. "You rebuilt it," he said. "You stayed." "I had to," I told him. "It's where they are." He sat with me by the river, the same river that had once taken everything from us. I saw his eyes soften as he watched the light play over the water. "I used to hate this place," he said, "but now it looks different." "It's not the river that changed," I said. "It's us." For a long time, we sat there in silence, listening to the flow of the water, that endless rhythm of loss and renewal. And as the wind carried the scent of flowers from the garden, I felt something lift from my heart, something that had been trapped there for years. That night, I dreamed again, but this time, I wasn't drowning. I was standing in the river, ankle deep, holding Emma's hand. Daniel was on the other side, smiling. The current didn't pull me down. It carried me forward, gentle as a lullaby. When I woke up, the morning sun poured through the window, golden and alive. For the first time since the night of the flood, I said the words out loud. I'm still here. And the river, in its quiet way, seemed to whisper back, so am I. Years passed, as softly as the tide that comes and goes without asking. My hair turned silver, my hands grew slower, but my heart had learned how to live again. The garden beside the river became my world. Every spring it bloomed brighter, and every petal felt like a small promise kept. People began to visit from the nearby town, curious about the old woman who lived by the river that once took her family. They would come to buy vegetables or ask for stories, and somehow they always stayed a little longer than they meant to. I never called myself a teacher, but I found myself teaching them anyway. Not lessons of words, but lessons of quiet. I tell them, listen to the water. It remembers everything, but it forgives too. They would look at me strangely at first, but then they'd sit by the bank and something in their faces would soften. The river had that effect. It took, but it also gave. Paul visited often now. He brought his wife and children, and laughter filled the yard again. Sometimes he would catch me watching the little ones play and ask, "Do you ever think about leaving this place, Ma?" I would smile and shake my head. "No," I'd say. "The river still needs me." What I meant was that I needed it. It had become my mirror, my memory, my forgiveness. Eli had built his own small farm not far from mine. We grew old together, not in love, but in understanding, a kind of quiet companionship that didn't need to be spoken aloud. We'd sit on the bench he made for me all those years ago, and sometimes he'd hum an old tune while I closed my eyes and listened to the river breathing. One autumn morning, the mist lay thick over the valley. I felt weak that day, my hands trembling as I poured tea. The air smelled of rain. I went down to the river one last time, slow but steady, leaning on my cane. The water was calm, shining like a silver ribbon under the gray sky. I sat on the bench, closed my eyes, and whispered, "I'm ready." I didn't mean ready to die. I meant ready to rest, ready to let go of the years of fear, ready to meet the river as an old friend, not an enemy. The wind brushed my face, soft and cool. Somewhere in the rush of the current, I thought I heard Emma's laugh, light and free. I thought I saw Daniel's hand reaching toward me, not in farewell, but in welcome. I smiled. "You taught me well," I whispered. "You taught me how to live again." When the rain began to fall, it wasn't a storm. It was gentle, warm, like the sky itself blessing the earth. The river flowed on, steady, endless, forgiving, carrying with it every story, every tear, every piece of love it had ever taken. And somewhere in its quiet voice, it carried mine too.